It's an honor to join you all, especially for this big conference, of course, on the Big Bang of digital communication, but also for the anniversary of your institution. These are important moments in public life because universities are they remain one of the most trusted platforms and organizations and institutions in our democracies. And so the extended life of the university campus and all of those of you who are researchers and students and faculty, you're very important to society. And so I want to start by thanking you for choosing this path. My role today is to tell you a little bit of the research that we've been doing on misinformation in public life and the Internet of Things. I have been spending a fair amount of time studying fake news, but I'm getting more and more interested in the solutions, in solving the problems of this form of communication. And so I'm going to end my talk by referring to some of the good ideas that may help us address the big problems in public life right now. I'll begin by sharing my screen, and we'll take you through the different forms of evidence that we have been collecting here at Oxford. My talk is broadly on human rights and the global information environment, but let me walk you through the agenda. I'll tell you a little bit about the team here. I'll tell you a little bit about my latest book, Lie Machines. And then I'll introduce some of the freshest research we've done on the global trends in misinformation and some of our specific work on COVID misinformation. And then I hope to land on the big punchline, what to do about it, the solutions for these big problems. And then perhaps for the last 15 minutes or so, I would enjoy a conversation, some questions from all of you about the material that we have or your own ideas for solving the big problems. My team here is called the Program on Democracy and Technology, and our mission is to improve civic engagement, to raise civic engagement, to increase it, and solve public problems through social data science. So it's very important for us as a group to use our research skills to do policy-relevant communication research to help make a good policy agenda and involve more people in political conversation and deliberation and in making good decisions. The bulk of our research is supported by the European Research Council. It has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and the Ford Foundation is very important to us for our public outreach work. Now, my most recent book is called Lie Machines, and it is about the production and the consumption and the distribution of big political lies. And these lies come from all parts of the world, from many different industries. There are many countries featured. As you can imagine, there's dedicated case studies that involve the Brexit debate here in the UK 5 years ago now, the 2016 and 2018 election in the United States, and a range of international issues that seem to have been bogged down or derailed in some way because of misinformation. Now, if you're a student or faculty member at the university, please send me an email if you'd like a copy of the book. I'll happily send you an electronic copy, especially if you're a student. If you're interested in purchasing the book, here's a discount code for 30% off at the publisher's website. But as I said, free for students. Send me an email and I'll happily share the electronic version. Misinformation has become, in my mind, one of the problems, the global problems, that prevents all other problems from being solved. It is very difficult for any kind of movement on climate change, on health, on global conflict, if the public is misinformed and doesn't fully understand what's going on, and if politicians don't want to use evidence in making their decisions. Certainly one of the biggest, most complex misinformation campaigns we have ever seen concerns COVID. And probably, if you're on social media, you've seen some of these messages somewhere. It's a complex campaign that involves the cult of personality around Bill Gates, a long-standing myth that the government is trying to put RFID chips in our arms, a public fear about 5G, and a fairly middle-class social movement about resisting vaccinations. And all of this has come together in a very effective misinformation campaign around the COVID vaccine. But that's sort of the most recent story. If we're to go back a few years, there's actually an important long-term trend. We have been doing here an annual inventory of countries with organized misinformation campaigns. Those of you, of course, living in Taiwan have had several elections now where misinformation campaigns have been organized by other countries and your neighbors. So this is not an uncommon problem, unfortunately, around the world. In 2017, we found just under 30 countries with organized misinformation campaigns. And keep in mind, these are not single lone wolf operations. These are formal organizations in the sociological sense. They have offices and telephones and hiring plans and performance bonuses. They have receptionists. They have retirement plans. They're formal organizations. Each year, 2018, 2019, in our most recent report, the trend line goes up, and we're actually not sure we'll run the report next year because pretty much every country we look at now, we can find some form of organized information operation. One of the interesting things that's changed over time is that more and more of the campaigns we study are actually being organized by private firms. It used to be early on that most information operations were organized by military units that had been retasked to doing social media. These days, it's regular PR communications firms based in Singapore and Bangkok, in Toronto, where I'm from, in London and New York. This is a mainstream offering now that many different kinds of lobbyists or politicians or governments can pay for. So it's become much more common as a technique for political engagement. About 6 months ago, we participated in a survey of misinformation, of public concern about misinformation. This was a global survey with well over 150,000 respondents, 142 countries. And what we found was that the perceived risk of disinformation is the #1 fear consistently for people around the world. Disinformation is the single most important fear of internet and social media use. More than half of the regular internet users are concerned about disinformation. Together with other internet fears, fraud, harassment, whether AI will take our jobs, almost 3/4 of internet users were worried about a mixture of these threats. Interestingly, there's quite a difference across the regions when it comes to fear of this threat. Concerns about disinformation are highest in North America and Europe, the lowest in East Asia and South Asia. Concern about online harassment is particularly high amongst young women, especially in Latin America. So the relative priorities from country to country shift, but globally, the fear of misinformation is the #1 risk people perceive. I want to tell you a little bit about our most recent COVID-related research. We've done a study of how far misinformation about the virus, about the causes and consequences, about its origins, or about the vaccination. We've studied how far this can travel. Now, to build this data set, we made a fairly simple, straightforward process of adding up the number of users from multiple social media platforms that each of the major news outlets have. We did the BBC, the CNN, the Guardian. The state-backed category refers primarily to 2 news distributors, CGTN, the Chinese state-backed media outlet, and Russia Today, the Russian state-backed media outlet. And then the category of junk news refers specifically to websites that specialize in junk health news. They specialize, that's all they produce, is misinformation about COVID. And many of these websites, perhaps you've seen them, will also try to sell you cures that are not cures, yeah? Coconut water, cinnamon and water, these are not cures for COVID, but at many of the websites we've studied and found and cataloged, they sell this and perhaps also t-shirts and baseball hats. And so this is a special category we call junk health news. Then, to build the data set, we looked at how many YouTube followers they have, how many Twitter and Facebook followers. We did Instagram. We did several of the multiples of the smaller media outlets and some of the social media platforms that are specific to particular countries. This chart summarizes what we found. On a good week, the average story from the BBC, say, about COVID health, can reach about 250 million users. CNN has a much wider reach globally, almost 800 million users for a good story. On some days, however, a piece of misinformation, a news story of misinformation from CGTN or Russia Today can reach almost 1 billion social media user accounts. Now, there's several factors that go into this. Often it takes a Hollywood star. If there's a prominent musician who weighs in with some health advice, that can take a news story and make it really big. A prominent politician can also retweet or share content from one of these outlets. We also know that many of these outlets have duplicate accounts or lots of fake users. So it's a rough estimate. But it does bring home the punchline that the state-backed media outlets can reach an immense global audience, and that the junk news outlets, the ones that sell fake cures, these outlets can also reach as many users as a Washington Post or BBC news story, depending on the week. Now, aside from the content, it's important to study the content of communication research. It can also be valuable to study the infrastructure, the structure that makes it possible to share information. Big technology firms, that we know which firms these are, they provide the infrastructure for many of the junk health news websites that I've been talking about. These are websites that protest public health measures, such as lockdowns or mask wearing. These are websites that promote COVID scams, frauds, or profiteering, and disseminate disinformation about public health. These are websites that tend to function because they seek to profit. They're primarily about raising money. They're not particularly about public health or trying to solve a big social problem. And what we've learned is that Amazon, Facebook, Google continue to profit even after the ads have been removed or the content has been moderated away. So even if you remove the COVID misinformation, there's still an infrastructure of support. Google, GoDaddy, Cloudflare, for example, continue to host websites, continue to provide the infrastructural support for this content. Google and Facebook in particular provide third-party technology services. They provide the behavioral analytics that make it possible to follow a user from a Facebook group to an anti-vax social movement, and then to be able to take their credit card to make a purchase. These tracker systems are basically what hold the internet together for advertising revenue, and cross-platform integration tools make it possible to build movements, to collect people into these silos where they get more misinformation. Interestingly, we find that this infrastructure is extraterritorial, so it doesn't always reside in the country where the content is directed. For example, a large portion of the misinformation about COVID that is directed to US citizens is actually hosted on infrastructure in Canada. We don't quite know why that is. It's very difficult to study some of these things from a distance as an academic researcher. I, like most of you, I believe, make use of open source data. So there are some things about the internet that we can't see. But we can detect the ways in which misinformation, where it sits, through a variety of techniques. And we find that COVID misinformation, unfortunately, tends to sit in my home country, in Canada. Now, this is the most exciting part for me, the strategies about what to do about it all. Our strategy for improving the global information environment needs to put social data science to work for human rights and for development. In very important ways, this is an economic issue and a political issue and a social issue. So how do we get there? What are the strategies for cleaning up misinformation? Here are several that I go into in the book, Lie Machines, and you'll recognize many of these ideas because they're commonly held now. I think experts and journalists, the interested public, are starting to coalesce around a set of policy guidelines that would be helpful for strengthening democracy. The first is fairly straightforward. Many researchers think that the training data that goes into algorithms when they're producing content needs to have high quality features, needs to have been transparently collected, and we need to know its full provenance, right? We need to know where training data comes from, what kinds of biases it has, or what kinds of biases it may create through its use. Most of the time, these kinds of algorithms that social media firms use cannot be reviewed. We do not understand how they get trained up. We don't get to see behind the curtain. And this is a very important global and national communications infrastructure that is built from training data we don't get to study, except indirectly. And so one of the first things I would advocate for is more transparent rules around the training data that backs up social information infrastructure. The second idea is something that I borrowed from the Blood Diamonds campaign, maybe 25 years ago. This was a campaign that tried to educate consumers about where their diamonds were coming from. Many diamonds at that point were coming from pits in Africa, mining pits in Africa, that had miserable conditions, where the miners were effectively indentured slaves, where they worked very hard and never saw the return of producing these very valuable rocks that then would be sold in Amsterdam, in global cities around the world for as jewelry. So the idea of the Blood Diamonds campaign was that if you could teach a consumer where their diamonds came from, most consumers would not choose a diamond that had come from these nasty conditions in Africa. They would choose a diamond that was ethically sourced. So just as with the Blood Diamonds campaign, the presentation to consumers was that they would produce the ultimate beneficiary. They would teach the consumer who was benefiting from the purchase of a diamond. I think we should be able to look at any one of our devices and ask it to tell us who is benefiting from the data it collects about us. So our smart television, our smart laundry machines, and our coffee makers, certainly our smartphones, collect immense amounts of behavioral data. And we don't know where that behavioral data goes, right? As consumers, we may have a vague sense that it goes to Silicon Valley, or we may have a vague sense that it goes to the major technology firms. But for the most part, the devices that collect information about us can't tell us where the information goes. I think this is the second step to building a healthy information infrastructure, especially for democracies. We should be able to look at our devices and have them tell us who is using our data. I think the next step follows logically from that. If we can get a list of the businesses, the political parties, the governments that are using data about us, we should be able to add beneficiaries. So if we have a favorite political party or a favorite church or a favorite union, and we want to share data with that organization, we should have that option. I think data sharing has become a way in which we now express ourselves as citizens. Now, part of that data donation may involve sharing data with researchers, and I, for one, would share my health data with medical researchers, especially in this COVID crisis. And I think there are many people around the world who would happily do so if they could. But unfortunately, our devices are not designed to do this yet. I think it's very important for infrastructure to tithe, right, to contribute to civil society, or to be set aside proportions of bandwidth, proportions of infrastructure, space on library hard drives. This is infrastructure that civil society doesn't always have access to, but I believe should be publicly supported. Then there are a few rules that I think are working well in the management of global data flows that I think should be transported to other parts of the world. In the United States, there aren't many rules that govern data mining, but one of the few good rules is the rule that a firm can't profit by sharing your voter information files. So when you register to vote, you tell what party you're most likely to vote for. That becomes a variable that a firm is not supposed to profit from by selling. Now, most firms will sell the other variables that get attached to that, right? Gender, credit card purchases, health status. So all those other variables become a valuable data set that's politically a good resource to have. But the firms are not supposed to profit by selling that one variable. I think there could be an expanded list of variables, mostly about public health or basic demographics, with which we could not profit, that are in the public domain, that could sit with national library systems and would not be allowed for profit and distribution. I think this would create more of a public resource around the data that's often about public problems. The final step, and many of you will have seen this argument before, would be to allow for more algorithmic audits to be able to fully understand why it is that you might get one form of news feed and somebody else in the call would get a different news feed, even having many of the same interests or priorities or backgrounds. At the moment, we do have algorithmic audit systems for high-speed financial trading, for video gambling software. There are audit mechanisms, so we know it is possible, but the technology industry has resisted greatly the prospect of having some kind of public oversight of these auditing opportunities. Now, I think it's important to frame the problem of disinformation within human rights. And let me ask all of you a question. Do we have the right to the truth? I think we have the right to access the truth. I don't think that we need to oblige the technology firms or the governments to always act as censors and try to decide what the truth is. But I do think we have the right to go looking for true information, accurate information, if possible, and to do so in an unencumbered way, right? So it should be easy to find high-quality information. Yes is my answer to this question for a number of political and sociological and communication theory reasons. For democracy to work, for deliberative democracy to work, citizens need the ability to go and find good quality information, to learn about the issues of the day. Politicians need experts to summarize problems and present solutions. We need our politicians to rely heavily on evidence when making their decisions. Unfortunately, I think there are a number of countries around the world where that's becoming difficult, where many politicians don't rely on evidence the way they should, and where there are political appointees to public administration that really should just focus on expert and technical issues and the most likely policy solutions. So solving this is important for democracy, for political expression, for our elections, for the maintenance of our human rights. I said at the outlet that I think misinformation is the one problem that prevents all other problems from being solved. In this way, it's also perhaps the one human right that makes other human rights possible. It is very difficult to know if other human rights are being violated, trampled upon, or respected, unless there is a high-quality information environment where we can know and trust what the trends are, where we can see what's going on and experience empathy for those who may be suffering. Without that information environment, it's difficult to know which human rights are being respected when. I think this is about some of the big policy challenges, the existential ones that we all now face, especially around the management of public health, perhaps also climate change, the distribution of nuclear resources, and the occurrence of conflict in the international system. Right? These are 4 safe issues where I'm confident most of us agree that we want high-quality information and we want to overcome these challenges in the future, but won't do so unless we have a healthy information environment. Then there is the operational exercise of voting. So most people, most of the time, don't use social media for politics. Those of you who are political communication researchers, or if you research journalism, you probably do use social media quite a lot for politics. But the average user is mostly interested in the family life, in culture, in international affairs, and in economics. But around election time, most voters do start to think about politics, and especially in the 2 or 3 days before they vote. Now, one of the challenges for our modern democracy is that in those 2 or 3 days, the major social media firms serve up vast amounts of misinformation to voters. So it is especially important in that election campaign period to have strong guidelines for both the platforms and for politicians on how to communicate, when to communicate, what must be credited for a campaign. And you know, most democracies already have these rules on the books. They already have the guidelines for what a healthy media environment should look like, how the parties are supposed to spend their money and declare their expenditures. The challenge is, however, that in most democracies, these public agencies, the election agencies, aren't well funded, or they're understaffed, or they don't have the ability to actually find a lobbyist or a foreign government or a politician who's using these techniques. So I believe it's very important to resource these agencies well, to have them well equipped with staff, and to give them the ability to find and punish bad players appropriately. Misinformation is the means through which racial and gender and religious discrimination now occurs. It's the means through which extremism and violence is stimulated, condoned, or ignored. I would also say misinformation is a threat to our economic life as well. It diminishes our trust in the technologies we love. It makes us less likely, perhaps, to shop online, to go and experience a virtual environment, if we know that it might be trolled or poisoned in some way by an organization or an individual seeking to do us harm or to mislead us. So I think it's important and valuable to frame this communication issue as a human rights problem. Now, I'll say a few minutes now, perhaps 5 minutes, about one of the big possible solutions to the problem, and then we can open up to questions and a conversation. One of the proposals out there now for addressing the challenge of a poisoned information environment is an international intergovernmental panel on the information environment. The acronym here is an IPIE. At the moment in climate change, there is an intergovernmental panel on climate change that has a very important role in coordinating science experts, communication researchers, and science experts and climate change researchers around the world, so that policymakers have the best possible research at hand when they make their policy decisions. I think we should take the model that we had for climate change and apply it to misinformation. The broad aims of an intergovernmental panel on the information environment could be to advance the research, to coordinate the science of misinformation, to track the global trends and identify the parts of the world where there's a serious or most serious problem of misinformation. This body could engage with multiple stakeholders. It will be very difficult to make any progress on misinformation without the collaboration of industry. We will need partners in industry to understand the technology, to explain what they're doing, and I don't think on their own government can solve some of the big problems. So in an important way, this is about stakeholder coordination, industry, government, and civil society. We also won't get very far solving misinformation without involving citizens, without drawing citizens in to the system of reporting, information operations, without providing good education and civic education opportunities in schools, for example. I think the IPE would have a role identifying the good approaches that seem to be working. Sometimes I get the sense that if there's a good policy idea that comes up in Australia, it doesn't get copied in Taiwan and Canada. People don't learn about it. So I see this as a clearinghouse, so that if the government in one country has a good initiative and it seems to work, perhaps it can be replicated in other countries as well. I think it's very important now to also build more bridges between industry and lawmakers in particular. In many governments, there aren't strong ties to the local technology industry or to Silicon Valley itself. An IPIE, an intergovernmental panel on the information environment, could help build those bridges. I list here 3 specific objectives: coordinating the research, promoting the information access, and sharing best practices. I think there are some broad aims we could identify, but these specific objectives are important and I think achievable with an intergovernmental panel on the information environment. I'm looking forward to questions and conversations in the next few minutes. I'll say a little bit about the research ahead for our team here, and would love to know during our questions about what you yourselves are working on now. We're going to continue our research on misinformation, particularly around COVID-19. We have a dedicated team working on PRC, China government-backed global information operations. There seem to be several now working in several countries. We've just issued a report on misinformation and its impact on children. I think this is a greatly understudied area. We have many research teams working on misinformation and adults, using survey data and data about individual social media use. But what will next year's voters, what will the voters in the years ahead, how will they behave? What will they think? How will they treat information sources? I think I can tell already my children are using very different social media from even what I use, and probably your younger brothers and sisters are also using technology in ways that you don't fully understand or use yourself. So being able to transport the research questions we have now to that next generation, their technologies, their habits, is an important item on our research agenda. We also have a dedicated project looking at complex humanitarian disasters. So these moments where an earthquake or a tsunami or a hurricane causes real strife, real problem in a community. These are also moments where misinformation circulates about the options for getting assistance, about who started it, the causes and consequences, or who is affected by it. And so spending time on these complex humanitarian disasters is going to be valuable for us. We as a team are doing more civil society trainings, and we have monthly briefings. If you go to our website, I'll see if I can drop it in the chat once we're done. We have a monthly briefing on COVID misinformation in email alert, and one on China-backed information operations. You'd be very welcome to sign up. And then I'm joining this campaign for an intergovernmental panel on the information environment. I think a policy option I'm excited by. Those of you who study misinformation like I do must often feel depressed. It's a depressing topic to research. And it's been 4 or 5 years now of studying the impact of misinformation on public life. This is one of my favorite cartoons, and I'll just end here. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. We're operating on fumes here. We're still operating on faith that the truth does matter, that it is valuable to do this research, and that we can clean up public life. I think there are things we can do to rescue the global information environment. And I may sound cynical, but I'm not fatalistic. I don't believe it's too late, and I look forward to working with everybody to try to create that information environment that we may all want to live in. I'll stop sharing my screen now and return control to Digne. There we go. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for Professor Howard. Yeah, it's very insightful research. I think it must take a lot of time, yeah, to do this kind of research. And particularly, it's based on evidence-based. I mean, in the world of misinformation, it's really difficult. You know, I mean, what account for what is the really evidence? Because a lot of evidence might be posturing, you know, posturing, or might be a propaganda based. So let's open the floor for question, because The professor saying he has a very generous. He will give out his electronic version of the live machine, the book, to our student. So our student, maybe fellow colleague, can raise question. Any question? Yeah, you can raise your hand. Oh, they type the question on the. Oh, can you see it? I cannot see it. Professor Howard, can you see the question? On the chat box. The chat box. Do we have a question here? There's one, I think one colleague raised hand. Okay.
Hello, Professor Howard. Yeah, I'm a student from世新University. Yeah, and I've heard you mention that you're working on the monthly alerts on COVID misinformation. Can you introduce it more?
Yes, happily. Thank you for your question. I have dropped a link in the chat. Perhaps you should turn your speaker and microphone off. Perfect. That'll help with the echo. Thank you very much for the question. So the link is in the chat. It's the first one, if anybody would like to sign up. This is a newsletter about COVID misinformation research, and it's got two types of content in it. First, we do a summary of the latest research on COVID misinformation. So these are academic papers and published findings. There's also a summary of the investigative journalism that is done by the major news outlets and commentary essays. We decided to produce this for policymakers because it's very often the case that most policymakers don't have time to read the latest research. So we do an email briefing that summarizes in 2 sentences the latest research findings and the most important pieces of journalism to read. I think we issue it twice a month now. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for answering.
Go ahead. I saw one colleague raise the question. Okay.
Thank you, Dean. There's a good question in the chat. May I take this one?
Okay. Sure.
So the question is, what should social media do to do about misinformation, intervene or block it? And there's a good example offered here about how Twitter blocked the US president. I do think blocks are reasonable if the terms are clearly set out before the block happens. So this was an incident in which Twitter had very clear policy guidelines. You could not incite hatred. You cannot do a range of things that violated the user group values, the community values. There are some experts, some researchers who think that Trump had done that for quite a while before Twitter actually took action. And there are other social media firms that take similar action. You know, they publish their standards and they act. When they use a consultative body, when they check in with their community of users, the firms have more legitimacy in doing these things. So I do think it is appropriate to block or intervene. I think the most common strategy is simply flagging content. Yeah, so and that tends to work because you teach users if something is suspicious, you let them make the decisions. I don't think the platforms or the governments should become our censors, right? We don't want them evaluating the truths like this. But it's up to all of us to have some good habits, yeah? We shouldn't share information unless we've read it ourselves. We shouldn't promote content from sensationalist or extremist sources unless we've explored it and checked it out ourselves. So I do think some of these reasonable controls are useful ways of protecting public life.
Any more question? Any more question? Okay, let me jump in. Because I heard, Professor Albert, you once saying democracy is strong when voters choose politicians, and it's always weak when politicians get to choose the voter. I mean, because so what is the prospect, of your assessment? I mean, for the war, this phrase you say right now, for the time being.
Thank you for your question. Yes, this is an important point. And while we're talking, if anyone would like to type their question into the chat, they're welcome to. That pops up here very quickly for me. The challenge, I think, for many political systems is being representative in a healthy way. So some countries run elections every 5 years, some do them every 4 years, some do them whenever the head of state decides to call an election. This is the parliamentary system. But it's very important that the politicians, the people who run for office, can't choose who votes for them and don't have special resources above what their competitors have. So it's almost always the case that some parties have more money than others. It's almost always the case that some parties have more data than others or are better at communication than others. I think as much as possible for the election campaign season, we want a fair and even playing field so that we understand what the liberal thinks, what the conservative thinks, what the center thinks, and each voter can by themselves make a decision about who to vote for. The democracies where institutions are weak are democracies where there's two forms of what we call gerrymandering. The one is where the politicians change the district boundary, so that they create districts of all their supporters. This is one process, especially in the United States, called gerrymandering. But the other process involves using social media to very quickly A/B test an ad that will go directly to particular users to let them create the publics that they need to garner support. Now, unfortunately for public life, these kinds of social movements are often about the negative. They say no. Even if there's a great policy idea that the head of the country is trying to advocate for, it's very easy to activate anger and get the public to say no to something. This means that sometimes the good ideas don't get enacted, even though the campaign against something isn't very deep or doesn't really have a good alternative. So this is why I say it's very important for the voters to choose their politicians, not have the politicians choose their voters.
For this, in Professor Howard's keynote, speech to happen, I need to thank, Professor Tsai. I don't know whether Professor Tsai was in our. Okay, Professor Tsai, you want to say hello to Professor Howard?
Professor Howard, Shubei Tsai speaking here. Oh, it's a great honor to have you as the keynote speaker. And now I would like to ask you a very interesting question. Smart technology really makes people smarter? Do you think so?
Thank you. Yes, this is an interesting question and a difficult one. I think your instinct is right that it doesn't always make people smarter, but I do think it is possible to provide a little more information to occasionally help people make better decisions. So I do think that there are moments where we need to do a search to find an old family member, or to look up a good idea for solving a public problem, for engaging with a municipal government or a national government, digital infrastructure does help the smartization of that process. I think it's a very important, and maybe this underlies your question, it's very important for the new technologies, the smart technologies, to come with user training and digital literacy skills so that people know how to use to get more out of their media. And you know, this was true when radio was new and when television was new. We needed media civic engagement programs through the schools to help people understand how commercials work and how to get the most out of the technologies available to them. We all know you can't just walk into a library and find the resource that you want. You can't just go to a library website and get the article you want. You need to know how to do some search terms, how to do a browse in a sophisticated way. And some of these skills are important to modern citizenship. So technologies, even they may be smart technologies, they don't make smarter citizens. But with the right social programs and peer support, I do think they can make citizens better equipped for good decision making. Thank you for your question.
Very, very exciting answer. And now I would like to push a little bit, okay, on this question, on this issue. If you would like to tell us one or two particularly pressing issues for the academic people to do, what would you like to suggest? One or two.
Thank you. Thank you. That is a very provocative one. I'm going to suggest things that I know I can't do. So I mentioned earlier that there isn't a lot of research on the next generation of technology users. So you and I may have, I'm sure we have different media habits from those of the younger generation. And the younger generation who are now going to be next year's researchers, they also have media habits that are different from the 9-year-old or the 10-year-old or 11-year-old. Sometimes the distance between what the 16 and the 17 and the 18 does and what the 9, 10 does is surprisingly significant. So I think one good step for research would be to figure out ways of understanding what the next generation of technology users is doing with information technology, and perhaps to think about the training or the resources, the civic programs they need in schools to make them be informationally smart citizens. Now, the second thing I know I can't do is study many of the platforms that are country specific. Taiwan is interesting for many places. For many reasons. There are several social media platforms used there that are not used in other parts of the world. This is also true for many other countries where there's social media platforms that are not Twitter, not Facebook, they're only used nationally. And understanding how those culturally specific social media habits and technologies form is very important to understanding the big picture. So I think studying what the next generation of technology users is doing and then studying the particular platforms that you know and love, these are two things that I think I would recommend for your new researchers.
Thank you a lot, my dear professor. And another question, which might be also very interesting. You are talking about data training. And now it seems that most people rely on big data. Firms and individuals. Do you think big data in some cases may backfire? Which means it is not beneficial. It can be very harmful in some cases.
Yes, this is a good question, and you point to a critical issue. Yeah, there are occasions where the data that goes into training algorithms is very old or corrupted or has bias against women or bias against men or biased against race or language groups. When these biases get entrenched in big data and we try to build new things with big data that is not very good quality, the new things don't last, or they make social problems worse, right? They introduce new forms or deepen discrimination. It's like building a building with cement that is the wrong mixture. Yeah, eventually the building will start to crumble and is not healthy for the occupants. You want to have big data, even if it's expensive or costly to make it fresh, to understand where the training comes from, the data comes from, to understand how the big data set was built is critical to making good research, to making good inferences from the data.
Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Ye, you would like to say something?
Okay. I believe there's one, we have a fellow student post another question.
Yes, and this is also a good one. There are some people who think that data science lacks a philosophy, especially in interpretation. I think this is true, but doesn't have to be, yeah? Data science by itself, just treated as a cold computer science with no social theory, doesn't always end up in productive findings or useful outcomes. The best combination is when the social scientist thinks carefully, uses theory, uses history, uses local context. Yeah, these things help the interpretation of data. Without them, it's very difficult to interpret the outcome of data science. So the best is actually a marriage or a unity between the two. And I would also say that the best combination is multi-method. So some qualitative, some comparative, some quantitative, and some computational. To make a good, strong argument, you often need pieces of each of these. So thank you for your question. I think it does lack a philosophical basis, but it doesn't have to. And it's very important, I think, modern social science does need to develop its computational skills. It's difficult to be a modern social scientist without having Python and your toolkit at hand. Thank you for this question too.
Howard, and any more questions? I think if not, we have maybe 2 minutes left. You know, I think I will jump in and because Professor Howard, you mentioned and particularly, you know, running the campaign require the so-called, you know, the information formal organization, and they do the information operation. But nowadays, you know, you're renting social media, I mean, voucher, it costs, you know, tons of thousands of dollars. So you probably, you know, need maybe a conglomerate or the deep pocket, you know, to run such kind of, I mean, campaign. And what is your opinion, you know, when the ordinary citizen to counteract, you know, this kind of operation?
Thank you. I think this is a fabulous question to end on, Dean, because it's the most practical one that's valuable for us as individuals. I think it's getting, in some ways, it's getting less and less expensive, yeah, for a political party to use some tricks, or for a lobbyist or another government to use some tricks to manipulate public opinion. But there are some tricks for ourselves, yeah. Read things before we share with our family. Maybe have one liberal newspaper, one conservative, and one center in your news diet. Have a couple of sources. I think it's also important to be aware that many of these social media algorithms are designed to take advantage of our cognitive biases. Yeah, so the psychologists tell us that we all have cognitive bias. We like the political parties we voted for before. Yeah, we'll tend to always vote for them. We avoid information that contradicts some decision we've already made. And the social media platforms like to give us sensational content that is already designed to fit with what they know we like. So once in a while, we need to challenge ourselves with a harder news source or a different one, learning another language. All these things are ways that we challenge ourselves to find new sources of information. And I think, again, these are things that the modern citizen needs to be able to do. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Howard. And I think one last reminder is I'm wondering, if the Cambridge Analytica is still operating. I mean, right now in the UK.
I believe the answer is that the name has changed and it has reformulated into a different organization. I believe the answer is that the toolkit is similar. So there may be staff and the same technologies are at play, but at this point, that corporate name has such a stigma to it. I'm pretty sure they had to change their name. I don't know that I don't know what countries it's still doing business in, but your question is a good one, because the real point here is that there are now many of those firms with different names operating in every country.
I think our time is running out. Okay. It's very, very thankful for Professor Howard to be on our keynote speech. I think this pretty much wrap up our session. Thank you, and I wish you all the best. Okay, thank you, Professor Howard.
Thank you, my dear professor.
Thank you, everyone. Good day.